Ashley, I know you spoke with a good friend of ours who's been a friend of Court TV for years and knows a lot, teaches this stuff. I call him Dr. K.
Yeah, Dr. Larry Koblinski. He really is sort of the encyclopedia of all things forensic. He teaches at John Jay College of Criminal Justice in New York City. And, this obviously was a day where we've got so many questions that all center around the remains. Because I'll tell you what, Vinny, every body tells a story. And right now, we need to know the story of how JJ and Tylee died. And more importantly, we need to know who did it to them. Sometimes those stories are held in that forensic evidence. So with that in mind, I had a whole lot of questions for Dr. Koblinski.
What exactly goes into the process of trying to identify children?
Well, we're talking about the remains of two children. And so we need to know what the condition of the bodies are in. Are they completely skeletonized? I would assume after several months of burial that they would be skeletonized. So there are limitations on what you can do upon autopsy. And clearly the main goal is to identify the remains. What is their condition? Are any of the bones fractured? Is there any indication of how they died? A lot of questions come about, and the autopsy is the first place to go for answers.
And it's such an uncomfortable topic, but it is so critical, as these could yield some of the most damning charges that jurisprudence even offers. Can I ask you about the length of time that these remains may have been buried? We don't know. The charging documents are suggesting a very big window, September to June. But we also know that Idaho is extremely cold. Can you factor in some of those metrics?
Yes, temperature is one of the most important factors in the rate of decomposition of a body. Humidity is a factor. Are they buried below ground? How deep? How cold? How humid? A lot of these factors will determine the rate of decomposition, because bacteria like it nice and warm so that they can do their jobs as decomposers. So yes, that is a major factor in determining what the remains look like upon autopsy.
Obviously, the more decomposition that has set in on remains, the more difficult your job becomes as an ME. Can you explain some of the things we can still determine and some of the things we can't?
Well, a forensic anthropologist and an odontologist, a forensic dentist, would be looking at the remains, assuming that you have complete skeletonization. You can determine things such as the age of the individual by looking at the dentition and examining the skull. There are things you look for. Are there any fractures? Because fracture evidence could help identify the individuals.
If, say, someone has broken an arm and been treated, that will be identifiable, in remains.
Correct. And the same for any kind of repair to the dentition or the teeth of each of the individuals by looking at repairs, amalgam fillings, and again, comparison to x-ray evidence.
That would require that there were dental appointments, that there were actual dentists during life. And those records might be tricky to also ascertain, especially if people live in many locales.
That is absolutely correct. And in addition to the autopsy, there needs to be some chemistry done, some analytical work. With skeletal remains, the best thing to do is a mitochondrial DNA analysis, because mitochondrial DNA are present in huge numbers in every cell. So there's a lot more DNA that one could look at, even in a skeletonized body. That's very typical of a forensic analysis of skeletal remains. Would be to do mitochondrial DNA. Each mitochondrion has more than one loop of DNA. So there's a lot of DNA that remains in skeletal remains. So what you need to do is a comparative analysis. First of all, compare each of the two children, look at their DNA to see if they match. If it does match, they could be siblings. And then to determine a maternal relative, whether it's a mother, a grandmother, who would share the same mitochondrial DNA. That would help determine the identity of the children.
And so what you're saying is that even if remains have decomposed to a point where they are just skeleton and there's no soft tissue, you can still retrieve that mitochondrial DNA.
Absolutely correct.
You also touched on something critical, and that is that it is the maternal connection that's most critical. So in order to determine who these children are officially, it is the mother and her relatives that will be critical. And if, for instance, you are in custody, that DNA should be very easy to access.
Yes, absolutely. And again, you're comparing one child against the other, because if they are siblings, at least on the maternal side, they would share the same mitochondrial DNA profile.
And if they're half siblings with the same mother, same story.
Same story, yes.
Then the most critical issue would become cause of death.
Yeah.
How difficult does it become the longer a body has decomposed?
It's very difficult. If there's no soft tissue and you're only looking at skeletal remains, you may not have a cause of death so obvious. There may be no knife marks or bullet trauma to the skeletal remains. There may be no physical evidence of the cause of death. And so it's a very difficult analysis.
Can I ask you if there's, say, some sort of chemical agent or poisoning or drug overdose? Would that be evident in the skeletal remains at all?
It's possible to pick up some poisons or toxins, but again, you'd have to eliminate environmental contamination to the remains as a potential source of whatever the substance is, like arsenic or something of that sort. The main focus is on identification, and second focus, cause and manner of death.
Cause and manner would be extremely difficult, again, the more the decomposition has done away with critical evidence, right?
Correct. I would think manner of death would be a little bit easier to determine rather than cause. Manner of death, you have two, and I'm going to say relatively young children, because we don't know precisely what the autopsy results have found. But, you would expect young children to be somewhat healthy and not having died of natural causes. So manner of death, I think, would be a little easier for a medical examiner to decide upon rather than cause. Skeletal remains are very, very difficult to pin a cause of death on.
And how willing are juries to accept this sort of arcane and complicated science when the remains are so decomposed?
Well, I think in the hands of somebody who knows how to explain properly these things. I mean, this is part of life. Jurors are, average lay people, and they do understand that over time, bodies decompose. And so I don't think there's anything difficult to grasp. They don't have to know the technicalities of the DNA work. They need to have faith and trust in the person delivering the testimony, describing the ins and outs, what's possible, what's not possible.
What other critical information might the discovery of these remains yield?
There may be evidence buried with the bodies that we don't know about. The children may have been buried in clothing, for example, or there may be evidence on the clothing, if in fact they were buried in clothing. That could be another piece of important evidence. So we have to actually see what we've got and read that autopsy report very closely and question the medical examiner. What did he see? What did he do? What did the anthropologist say? What did the odontologist say? There's a lot of factors coming to play on these two remains. And so you got to put all the pieces of the puzzle together.
So, Vinny, that puzzle is hopefully going to be put together by the Ada County, Idaho medical examiner once that office gets the remains, if they don't already have the remains. That was the process today. And I think what's really critical here is that the stories that those bodies will tell the medical examiner will likely end up being told in affidavits and warrants and court filings in the way of charges. Because as you and I both know, cause of death is critical. It's very, very important. You don't always get it. You didn't have it in Casey Anthony's child's death. That's what hung that jury up so hard. But you know what? You just might. And I wouldn't be the least bit surprised if you see some movement on charges against Lori and Chad in the not too distant future.
Yeah, I would think so. So what happens next now in this process?
Well, that's exactly what happens. Those remains are on their way to the Ada County examiner, the official cause of death, and then the official release of the identities will happen. That actually hasn't happened yet, but it did come from the families. Obviously, the families are a very integral part of this. I can tell you that that the grandparents of JJ, who you see pictured here, Larry and Kay Woodcock, were traveling today. Couldn't get confirmation as to where they were traveling, but if I were a betting man, they're probably traveling to Idaho. And so obviously families are told things a lot faster than the public. But I expect that you will probably have a positive identification on these children publicly. Look, I don't know how fast they work in Idaho. I don't know how COVID has affected their offices, et cetera. And then the prosecutor's office will be chomping at the bit to get those results and hopefully have some kind of cause and manner of death on a document so that they can go forward with their very difficult work. And then you and I go forward with our difficult work too, covering cases to hopefully find justice for these two kids.
Absolutely. Ashley Banfield, thank you so much.
Sure thing.